What the Browns do with the number 2 overall pick could signal just how safe Andrew Berry and Kevin Stefanski are beyond 2025. I'll explain coming up next on the Locked On Browns podcast.
You are Locked On Browns, your daily Cleveland Browns podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Dog Pound? I'm Spencer German, your host of the Locked On Browns podcast, and proudly covering your Cleveland Browns each and every single day in the land and on the road. If the Browns don't take a quarterback at number 2 overall, it could actually be a sign that Kevin Stefanski and Andrew Berry are safe beyond whatever happens in 2025. I don't know if I like that. How the new salary cap impacts the Browns' free agent plans, and don't trust anyone who's reporting the Browns are already locked into a certain player at number 2. I do want to thank you for being an everydayer with the Locked On Browns podcast and for making this your first listen every single day. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Right now, new FanDuel customers can get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. So I find it interesting, as we talk through all these different iterations of what the Browns are going to do at number 2, the different quarterback options. And, quarterback is obviously the most highly debated position among the fan base, among anybody who covers this team right now. Should they take a veteran or should they sign a veteran and sort of bridge the gap? Should they take a rookie and have hopefully this path towards the future with a franchise guy? And I understand both sides of the argument. And I've started thinking a little bit about, as you start coming up with iterations of what they do in the draft that don't include taking a rookie, I've come to this place where I almost wonder if the Browns decide, we're going to sit this year out when it comes to drafting a quarterback because we just don't. And I want to be clear because I do think they will take a quarterback no matter what at some point. What I mean, though, is like if they take a quarterback in like the second or third, maybe not the second, but if they take a quarterback in like the third round, that's going to be more of a project like a Will Howard or something. I almost wonder if it's like, okay, we're going to take a chance on this guy, but we don't necessarily consider him our franchise guy. We're just going to let him develop behind a veteran and see what happens from here. Taking a quarterback at 2 would have essentially signal, hey, this is our franchise guy. We believe we have our solution at quarterback right here, right now in this building. So that's the point I'm trying to make here. If they don't take one at 2 and they basically say, yeah, we'll take one later as a project, but we're not taking a quarterback right now that we think is the future for us. We want to wait till next year. Is that a sign that maybe Andrew Berry and Kevin Stefanski are actually safe beyond whatever happens this upcoming season in 2025? Like, would that be them sort of conceding like, yeah, we're not doing it this year because we know we have time to get this position right and we like next year's class more? Because there's the two different worlds here. There's the world where like they sort of play it safe and they say, you know what, I know we need a quarterback, but we're going to take the position that if we have a player that's graded higher than these quarterbacks, we're going to take that guy here because we think we can figure it out with a bridge quarterback this year and then really land that guy next year and see if we can sort of piece this all together differently. We're not going to reach on a quarterback this year because we feel better about next year's class. That would sort of signify that they're not operating from a place that they're operating from a place of leverage. Like they have some leverage in this conversation that they know they're going to be back next year, and that that Jimmy has them and ownership has shown some patience with them, which has been true. The other side of the coin is, well, we have to take a quarterback right now because we have to get this right, and we do believe that these guys could be good, and they have some rawness to them. They got to get through, and we got to sort of coach them up. But we think they'll be okay. And we feel strongly that we can identify that guy in this class. And so if it's the former option, if they trade back or they just draft a different player and they forego taking a quarterback at 2, I think it could signal that they maybe have been given the indication that they're going to have some leeway here. They're going to have a leash to figure this thing out after the Deshaun Watson debacle and get this thing back on track. Now, I really hope that their job security hasn't been guaranteed already. I would hope that's not the case, but I've started to wonder that a little bit more as the months ahead play out and we get closer to the draft and we see what they eventually do. Like you would have to feel strongly about next year's class and that you're going to be here to potentially take a guy in next year's class if you pass on 1 at 2 this year. Just, I mean, straight up, that's what it feels like this would be setting up to be if that happens. And I just don't know if that's the smart move for the Browns. Like, I don't think Jimmy Haslam would guarantee something like that at this point. Like, I think he goes year to year. I do think he has shown over the last couple years that he's willing to be more patient than he has in the past. He doesn't just make gut reaction decisions, because if he did, Andrew Berry and Kevin Stefanski, at least one of those two, probably would have been fired at the end of this season. But I do think he trusts them. And the question becomes, like, how long does that last? If you put together another 3-14 season, is that enough to run these guys out of town? I wouldn't bet on it being the case that he's guaranteed them anything beyond 2025, because that just doesn't seem like something Jimmy Haslam would do, even with the patience that he is now starting to show. And on some level, I do think this group deserves an opportunity to see if they can get out of this mess that may or may not have been created by them, depending on who pushed most for Deshaun Watson. We've heard certain reporting that it was more so an ownership decision. We've heard that, Andrew Berry was all about it, so maybe he had a bigger role in it. But even still, like, okay, I can understand giving them some leeway here to find a path forward out of this and see if you can course correct after the Deshaun Watson disaster, and that's why they're coming back next year. But if they have another losing season, I don't know that I can sit here and argue for both. And I haven't really been arguing for both of them to be back this year. I'm more so a Kevin Stefanski truther, I guess, in that way. I think he's a bigger, part of the solution than the problem. Whereas Barry, I think, hasn't proven enough as a GM and a talent evaluator and a drafter to make me feel confident about his ability to do that going forward on the other side of this Deshaun Watson situation. But hey, he's getting another shot. And I think, on some level, like I said, I can understand that, as, they're not putting it all on him that the Deshaun Watson thing didn't work out, and you're giving him an opportunity to fix it. Okay, fine. But does that mean he gets another year after this to sort of fix it if things don't go right? I wouldn't imagine that would be the case. I'd find that hard to believe. And part of that for me is just like, if Andrew Berry can't identify players this year with some different opportunities in front of him, I mean, if he does trade back and he takes that chance of not drafting a guy at 2, and he, identifies a bunch of other players, if those players don't come, if the players you then draft with the picks that you accumulate in a trade or even a Myles Garrett trade don't pan out, or the team still struggles in certain areas and the talent isn't really in those players that you're adding aren't, necessarily working out still, like, do you really want him coming back the following year and drafting for you again? Like, probably not. Like, development is part of the process, and being able to identify talent is a major thing here. That's kind of eluded Barry to this point. So there shouldn't be a guarantee that anyone is safe beyond this season right now. This regime has earned, I guess, an opportunity with their 2 playoff appearances in a 5-year window to see if they can get this thing back on track, especially just a year removed from making the playoffs. But beyond 2025, this cannot be a situation where Andrew Berry and Kevin Stefanski, and more so even Andrew Berry, are going into the draft like, hey, if we don't take a quarterback at 2, it's okay, because I know that I'll be here next year to get this thing figured out with maybe a quarterback that we like more. I don't know that any GM kind of goes into this process like with that mindset anyway, of thinking like, well, hey, I'm not going to get this right. I think they all feel confident that they're drafting guys who are going to help their team and are the right picks. But yeah, it kind of just struck me, if they pass on a quarterback at 2, that's the only pick. The only place you could pick a quarterback in this draft would be at number 2. That would make you feel like, okay, we are drafting our franchise guy. And if they don't do that, how much confidence is there that this team's going to be, a good team next year with just a bridge option? Maybe they feel that way, but they and I just wonder if that move would suggest that they're going to get another opportunity to do that in 2026 if things don't work out. I hope that's not the case. I don't think that should be the case, because this organization, for me, this brass is really on a prove it. They're in a prove it situation right now. They got to go out and they got to win next year. They got to bring in talent to help supplement this roster. And then we can talk about, whether or not they deserve another year under their belts in 2026, or if they deserve to still be paired together, or if maybe just one of them has to go and the other one gets to stay. But those are conversations for a later date. I would hope that nothing has been guaranteed going into this current offseason. We will continue talking about the offseason and what lies ahead from Andrew Berry, because the draft is on one side of it, is one big piece, but so is free agency. And we just found out this week that what the salary cap range will be for 2025 for the NFL season. What does it mean for the Browns? What does it mean for free agency? I'll explain coming up next on the Locked On Browns podcast. When the game tips off, the NBA action is just getting started, and there's no better place to get in on it than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. With FanDuel, you can place live bets throughout the game, so even if you miss the opening tip-off or you want to bet on a fourth quarter comeback, you can stay in the action. And if you're looking for a bigger payout, you can even combine your live bets into a same-game parlay. With the NFL season behind us, I've been betting a ton of the Cleveland Cavaliers. They have a real shot at winning the title this year. That could be a bet that you get in on, a futures championship bet for the Cavs. And there might be some opportunities to win there amidst some of these other in-game bets you can place, same-game parlays, etc., etc. It's all available to you with the FanDuel app, which is easy to use, and you get paid instantly when you win. Right now, new FanDuel customers get $150 in bonus bets if your first $5 bet wins. Just visit FanDuel.com to join today. That's FanDuel.com for your shot at $150 in bonus bets. Make every moment more with FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of the NBA. All right, so we found out this week that the new salary cap for 2025 has gone up over $20 million for the upcoming season. It was $255 last year. It's going to be somewhere in the range of $277.5 and $281.5, which is a massive jump yet again for the salary cap. And the biggest thing, the most important part of this, as far as the Browns are concerned, is just the fact that this is the reason why you see Andrew Berry doing what he does with these contracts, where he kicks money down the road and essentially, says, hey, we'll pay this later and save ourselves from having to take these big cap hits now on, certain contracts and dead money and all these different things, because you're banking on the cap's just going to keep going up, and you can take on larger portions of those payments down the line when it makes up a smaller percentage of the cap, if that makes sense. So from a logistical standpoint of where the Browns are at with this new salary cap figure, and even if you stay on the lower end of it, and let's just say it's like 278, which is like 0.5 over what the bottom line number that they put out there was. So that essentially means that the Browns, with the rule of 51, which only makes you count the top 51 contracts on your roster against the salary cap during the offseason, they would be about, 15-ish million over with just that factored in. But there's other payments that you have to think about here. So you have to add in the fact that they have $40 million in rollover cap space, which is important because rollover cap is basically cap space you didn't use the year before that rolls over to the next year to give you a larger salary cap number. It's an individual number for each team based on how much money they didn't spend on the salary cap. And so for the Browns, because Andrew Berry created enough cap space by reworking deals, they have $40 million in rollover cap to move into 2025, which puts their official salary cap number is going to be somewhere in the range of like $320 million, maybe just below that, maybe a little bit more than that, just depending on where the eventual cap falls. And so then you also have to add in the dead cap money, which right now for the Browns is just under $40 million, about $39 million or so. And so you throw that into the mix, and you're talking about a Browns, a number that puts the Browns about $20 million or so over what their final salary cap is going to be. They're at about they're just over $300 million with their Rule of 51 salaries, and then you throw in this to get them up. You throw in the rollover cap, which puts them at about 320, like I said, and so you add in that 39, and so you're talking about being like 20 million over. So the 39 million in dead cap, you're about 20 million over in terms of the salary cap that is unique to the Browns for this offseason. I'm sorry, I'm not trying to be too convoluted here and go over your head with all this, but the point I'm trying to make is now that they know that what that number is generally going to be, this is where Andrew Berry starts working his magic with the contracts and moving money around. He's likely to start with Deshaun Watson's deal. And last year at the NFL Combine, which is obviously coming up next week, we saw him rework a couple contracts. I remember Denzel Ward was one of them. I think Miles was one of them, but there was a couple people who were involved in this where they moved some money around, created cap space, and that's going to set the stage for whatever they're going to do in free agency in a couple weeks from now, March 12th, when the new league year officially opens. So they'll get back under the cap, no problem. This is why Andrew Berry does this way, and it's the one thing I will give him credit for. He's been great at. He has been great at the money movement, the money management, the cap space reworking, and creating the cap flexibility needed to essentially give this team opportunities to add and make the team better and improve the team every single offseason. Now, what I think is interesting is like what this means for the philosophy that the Browns will take into free agency specifically, because the draft is a different beast. But usually the last couple years, this Browns team, I think, has approached free agency with this idea of, okay, this time frame of the offseason is about us adding players that we think will help us get over the top, that will help us become the Super Bowl caliber team that we think we can be, that will help us compete in the playoffs. Filling in the cracks, I think, has kind of been how free agency has been viewed in the past. I think this year, the roles kind of reverse for how free agency is treated and for how the draft is treated, especially now that you have first-round picks again. Like, that was what I think free agency was in the past for the Browns. This year, I think it just becomes about like, all right, we have some holes to fill. Let's find some guys that can help us, now and maybe in the future, but we're not going to be spending, they're not going to be spending like drunken sailors. They're going to make smart moves. They're going to look for guys like, I think, for example, somebody like Trey Greenlaw as an outside linebacker. I don't know what the future holds for Jeremiah Owusu-Koramoah, and that's something we do need to talk about more throughout this offseason. If he really can't play anymore, and only the Browns know what he's been told to this point, like, that's a need. That's suddenly a need that they have that they weren't maybe necessarily accounting for in the past. And so if a guy like Trey Greenlaw might make some sense, because I think you're going to get him on like a 1-year prove-it deal worth like $6 million or something like that, that allows him to sort of prove himself worthy of a bigger contract, because he's a great player when he's healthy, but he's dealt with so many injuries. He only played in 2 games last year. Like, that's kind of the thought process I have on this, is like, they'll use this money, they'll use this opportunity in free agency to fill needs on smaller contracts that aren't going to like break the bank. I don't think they're going to sign some mega long-term deals with guys, which is why Sam Darnold, as much as I think they could get under the cap enough to make a move like that, I don't know if they're going to commit $40 million to Sam Darnold a year. If their plan is ultimately like, yeah, we need a rookie this year or next year, because we've seen it. Like, that's the way you find franchise quarterbacks. And so they're going to be limited in what they can do. I'm not trying to say that, as much as I say, like, you can always make the money work, and theoretically Andrew Berry could make the money work somehow to get, create enough space to do some mega deal if they really needed to. But I don't think that's where his head's at with this. I think it's going to be about like sort of adding some of these ancillary pieces, filling some holes that they don't necessarily think they're going to be able to address in the draft. But the draft is where they'll focus on rebuilding this roster back into a championship contender, versus in the past, I think the roles were reversed here. In free agency was the thing that was supposed to help you, that was the opportunity to put this team over the top with certain additions or signings. Now I think it's the opposite, because the team's in a different place than they were a year ago, and you have so many things you got to sort of supplement and fill and fix, that having these first-round picks, maybe having an opportunity to trade back and get more picks, this is where roster building becomes so important for you and for the future of this franchise. So I think the script kind of flips on what they're going to do with both those portions of the offseason, free agency, and then the draft. And it's just about, again, like, where you're at now, actually having picks. And yeah, they could spend money. They could go out and make a big deal for somebody. I just don't think that's going to happen, because they aren't, they are strapped in terms of like how much flexibility they have. They could always make enough. There's always ways to make enough room to have the ultimate ability to do whatever you want in free agency. But I don't think that Andrew Berry is going to do that, and it doesn't feel advantageous to where they're kind of at cap-wise right now to just add some more mega payments onto this salary cap that's already pretty bloated. So I think this year is about sort of like steadying the ship with players that'll help you be competitive, but on deals that are sort of cost efficient, and focusing your attention more so on like, roster building through the draft and roster completion through the draft. That's where I think they're going to sort of focus this year in relation to previous years. And that's why where the cap is at matters for how much money the Browns are going to have and how much flexibility the Browns are going to have to be able to do those things. Speaking of the draft, which we've talked about already throughout this episode, and whether or not the Browns are going to take a quarterback at number 2, anybody who is trying to tell you or report that the Browns already have their minds made up about what they're going to do at number 2 is full of it. I'll explain why coming up next on the Locked On Browns podcast. All right, so I've seen some reporting out there in relation to the Browns' decision at number 2. And there are some people who seem to be suggesting like the Browns are taking a quarterback. They already know what they want. They already know what they're doing. And I just think this time of year, I just have a hard time, and I've warned you against like believing anything that seems like the Browns have a definitive answer on what they're doing with the second pick at this juncture of the offseason. It's just too early. Like I don't think the Browns right now have it all figured out in terms of their game plan for number 2. I think right now in February, you're looking and you see a number of different avenues and options. Yeah, you could take a quarterback. You could stay pat and take a player that you think is better or more worthy of being taken number 2 that could help you in a different area, like an Abdul Carter that I know has been thrown around. You also could trade back. Now, I've said I think the only real options are take a quarterback if you believe deep in your convictions that there's a franchise guy there, you got to do it, or you trade back because that gives you more picks to then pick more players, and the drop off from like taking Abdul Carter 2 to taking a guy at like 4, 5, 6 that still maybe fills a need and is a starter for you. I don't think it's so massive that it wouldn't be in your best interest to do something like that. So for me, those are the only 2 options, but that doesn't mean the Browns aren't thinking through every single iteration and scenario of how things could play out. They're thinking through who they could maybe trade back with, the Giants, the Raiders, maybe somebody else that we're not talking about enough yet. Like there are so many different options at this point. I can't definitively say anything is for sure on February 21st. And I think there's a big difference here. Between last year and this year. Like last year, the quarterback class was so good. I mean, you had like 3, maybe 4 guys that had pretty high grades that people believed were going to go in the top 10 or near the top 10. It was a no doubter. Like the Bears maybe being locked into Caleb Williams in February made more sense than a team like the Browns or the Titans being locked into anybody at 1 or 2. And that's another thing, by the way, the Titans still have to pick before the Browns as well and have a decision to make. So it'd be hard to be locked into any decision when your decision depends on somebody else. But when you have the first pick, like it makes a little more sense to sort of be like locked in on something, especially if you know it's like a dire need, and especially if you know you need a quarterback. Last year, the Bears linked to Caleb Williams for as long as they were made a lot of sense because they needed a quarterback. This guy was supposed to be the next generational talent. I still think he can be. He showed some good things last year, and I think part of it was just the coaching, the situation he had from a coaching standpoint. I'm actually excited to see what Ben Johnson does for him, but that's a different conversation entirely. But it was different last year. This year, you don't have that. There's questions about these quarterbacks. I don't know that like there's certain positions that are deep, but there's not like a Myles Garrett in this class that you're like, you have to have this guy at number 2. I mean, even somebody like Travis Hunter, who maybe would fall into that realm or that ilk. There's questions about like, what is he going to be at the next level? I don't know that he would be wide receiver 1 if he was just a wide receiver, or cornerback 1 if he was just a corner. The lure of Travis Hunter is that he plays both ways. And is that going to be something that's actually viable for him at the NFL level? So I can't sit here today and tell you the Browns for sure know what they're doing, on February 21st or in late February when there's still the combine next week. Free agency still has to happen. As I talked about, like there's going to be opportunities for the Browns to add to this roster in free agency. And if maybe they end up with Matt Stafford. If they do something like that, like I think quarterback's off the board at 2. So then all these people reporting like, yeah, they're locked into a quarterback. Like, no, I just can't buy into the idea that in late February, before we get through so many different phases of the offseason, as I said, the combine, free agency, pre-draft visits that are going to be happening with these players over the course of the next month plus before the draft on April 24th. Like I don't feel confident based on things that I've heard or based on things that I feel in saying like they have their definitive answer right now. There's too much still in play, whether it's the Titans picking before you and what they're going to do with their pick, whether it's, calls that have yet to be made about potential trades up the board from teams below the Browns, whether it's, how filling needs and free agency goes before you get to the draft and then have to fill out the rest of your roster. There's just so much still in play, so much still at stake, and so many other decisions that have to be made before I can just sit there and be like, yep, they know what they're doing. They have their mind made up. So I just warn against that. I warn against like believing or buying into any one definitive direction that some people may believe the Browns are sort of signaling they're going with. And that's why, it's another reason why, as I talked about last week, the smoke around Shedeur Sanders, it's fun. It's enjoyable. It makes you dream about a potential franchise quarterback finally coming to Cleveland and that the Browns feel like they've identified that guy. But it does feel a little bit too good to be true right now because it's still so early in this process and there's still so much that could play out on top of the fact that it's smokescreen season. Teams are always putting stuff out there, trying to see, trying to manipulate the board or the draft to fall in a way that is advantageous to the players that they maybe really want. So it could all just be for nothing. And I think there's an important conversation to be had next week, probably starting off the week, about the things to keep an ear out for at the Combine, because how the conversation starts between the Browns and Cam Ward, now that they have a chance to really interface with him more, is going to be a fascinating thing to follow. And I look forward to talking about that with you more next week. But it's another episode down with you, Dog Pound. I appreciate you, as always, making the Locked On Browns podcast your first listen every day. For your second listen, go find the new Locked On NFL show, or if you want to keep it local, you can check out Locked On Cavs or Locked On Guardians. Thanks for being an everydayer at the Locked On Podcast Network. I will talk to you again real soon, Cleveland.